When researchers document historical bridges across Europe and North America, they typically focus on what's visible above water, the elegant arches spanning rivers, the ornate stonework adorning their railings, the engineering marvels that connected cities for centuries. But the real story, one that emerges only during droughts, dewatering projects and river diversions, begins below the waterline. It started with a straightforward water management initiative. Engineers across multiple continents received orders to redirect water for irrigation projects, urban development, and hydroelectric maintenance. The objective was utilitarian: lower water levels temporarily, assess infrastructure integrity, and determine whether aging bridges required reinforcement. But the instant water levels dropped below historical minimums, something unforeseen occurred. They exposed foundations that had remained submerged for centuries. Below the bridges of Europe and North America, at depths exceeding what any modern engineering assessment had documented, inspection teams discovered support structures that matched no recognized construction timeline. Their positioning was peculiar, their depth was impossible, and the masonry bore no resemblance to anything in the official bridge records. It didn't even echo the Industrial Revolution construction methods as typically understood. This never appeared in official statements. It failed to reach the engineering journals documenting drought conditions. Yet in internal documentation from those years, a specific phrase emerges repeatedly: unprecedented foundation depth, anomalous construction, inconsistent with documented bridge specifications. The authorized account would eventually reduce all of this to measurement errors, sediment accumulation creating illusions of depth, or merely misidentified structural additions from forgotten renovations. Nothing remarkable, nothing deserving attention. But the inspection footage from that period reveals something else. They reveal engineers positioned beside pier foundations extending 40, 50, even 60 meters below the riverbed. Depths that make no sense for bridges supposedly built to span rivers that were, according to all historical accounts, never more than 15 meters deep. Stone pillars carved with decorative details far below any waterline that should have existed. Ornamental work positioned at depths where no human eye was ever meant to see it, crafted with precision that modern concrete cannot replicate. And the further down the inspections went, the more the structures ceased resembling practical bridge construction and increasingly resembled monuments that had been partially buried, submerged, and purposefully forgotten. Initially, the inspection crews attempted to classify everything in the most straightforward manner. The bridges must have been built during an unusual drought period, the rivers must have been much lower historically. Perhaps there were temporary cofferdams that allowed deeper construction. But as documentation grew and additional bridges were examined, the contradictions expanded. Why were certain support piers decorated with intricate carvings 30 meters below the current riverbed? Why were particular foundation stones shaped with architectural details as though meant to be viewed from the surface? Why did certain pillars continue downward with consistent craftsmanship well beyond any depth that construction technology of their supposed era could reach? And the matter that disturbed even the most conventional structural engineers: why were these lower foundations so massive? The bridges above required supports adequate for their spans and loads. Yet the foundational stonework below bridges across the Rhine, the Danube, the Thames, the Mississippi, and the Ohio appeared constructed for structures vastly larger than what currently stands above them. Inspection teams privately acknowledged amongst themselves that the depth and magnitude didn't correspond with any historical construction documentation. And while none of them employed terminology like pre-flood civilizations, they were recognizing something equally disturbing. These weren't merely bridge foundations, they were the upper portions of something far more substantial. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. As the inspection reports multiplied, so did the quiet. Documentation grew briefer, technical analyses became ambiguous. Footage ceased displaying the deepest perspectives of the foundations, and then the water levels began rising again as drought conditions eased and water management projects concluded, and much of what had been revealed was returned to obscurity. Only pieces survive: engineering reports, several photos, and the subdued accounts of structural inspectors who examined the sites before access was restricted. But even from what endures, a configuration becomes apparent. Foundations too deep for any documented bridge construction. Stonework too ornate for submerged infrastructure. Building techniques that appear to assume a completely different ground level. Supports that seem to originate from an era when the rivers didn't exist, or existed at dramatically different depths. The initial anomaly was ornamentation. Bridge piers 30 metres below the surface displayed carved stonework, decorative mouldings, and architectural embellishments identical in quality to the visible portions above water. Different construction logic shouldn't exhibit that. You don't decorate what cannot be seen. You don't invest in craftsmanship for infrastructure that will be buried in riverbeds. Yet below bridges across 2 continents they did. Cornices positioned 40 metres down, sculpted figures 20 metres beneath the mud. Architectural details that maintained the same aesthetic standard, even when divided by depth that should have been solid earth, according to every geological survey. It was as though whoever constructed these bridges built them when the ground level was dramatically higher, or when the rivers didn't exist at all. As inspection teams documented deeper, the anomalies grew more troubling. Below the anticipated foundation bases, they encountered continuation of structural elements that resembled nothing like practical buried construction. Substantially larger support columns, considerably more refined joinery, configurations that appeared too architecturally sophisticated for anything meant to be hidden underground. Certain foundations featured archways and vaulted spaces, with perfect geometry executed with accuracy that didn't correspond to the crude cofferdam construction methods documented for their supposed build dates. These weren't temporary construction features meant to be buried. These were permanent architectural elements designed to be seen, designed to be impressive. And then arrived the finding that confused even the most experienced civil engineers: the impossibility of the construction itself. Modern bridge building in rivers requires massive cofferdams, water pumping operations, and temporary diversions to create dry working environments. These operations are expensive, complex, and leave extensive documentation. Yet there exists no historical record of construction operations adequate to build at these depths. No documentation of cofferdams reaching 40 metres below water level. No accounts of the massive pumping operations that would have been required. No records of river diversions extensive enough to allow dry construction at depths we now know these foundations reach. Engineering calculations performed on the footage demonstrate this unmistakably. The pumping capacity required, the materials needed for cofferdams, the labour force necessary, all would have exceeded the documented resources of their construction eras by orders of magnitude. These foundations appear as though they were built in the open air, then subsequently buried under metres of sediment and rising water levels. But the most troubling detail was not what surfaced in the inspection footage. It was what failed to surface in the archives. The authorised histories composed about these bridges scarcely reference foundation depths at all. Certain engineering diagrams show only shallow footings. Particular aspects of the submerged structure are omitted entirely from historical documentation, even though the photographic evidence demonstrates they were far more extensive than recorded. The silence is difficult to overlook, because if these foundations genuinely belong to the documented construction dates, why weren't their actual depths recorded? Why weren't the sophisticated submerged construction methods explained thoroughly? Why were the inspection photos quietly archived rather than publicised as remarkable engineering achievements? Even certain structural elements presented concerns. Joints too precise, surfaces too refined under metres of mud, architectural details too consistent for infrastructure supposedly built in challenging underwater conditions. Details that appeared less like hasty construction beneath temporary cofferdams and more like leisurely craftsmanship executed in open air. What the water level drops revealed were structures that didn't correspond to documented bridge construction practices, didn't correspond to practical buried foundations, and didn't even correspond to one another in their supposed construction dates. Instead, they constituted a peculiar architectural vocabulary, one that appeared to span multiple centuries, yet somehow remained cohesive, proportional, and impossibly ornate for submerged infrastructure. The initial surprise arrived with the ornamentation itself. These weren't plain support columns designed purely for structural function. They were architecturally elaborate pillars, foundations shaped with decorative proportions, carved details that preserved their intricacy perfectly despite centuries underwater, and stone surfaces arranged with aesthetic purpose, almost like the lower portions of grand monuments rather than buried bridge supports. Certain foundations were so elaborately carved that engineers assumed the decorations must have been added near the water surface. But detailed inspection proved the ornamentation continued uniformly downward, maintaining consistent quality 30, 40, 50 meters below the modern riverbed. Refined stonework, architectural flourishes, and design elements that generated more mysteries than solutions. And then arrived the characteristic that still confounds researchers presently: the massive scale of the lower structures. Formerly, engineers explained these as necessary for stability in unstable riverbeds. But nothing about them corresponds to documented engineering calculations or foundation design principles. These foundations were too large, too deep, and too architecturally elaborate, as though they were designed to support bridges 3 or 4 times the size of what currently spans above them. Certain pier bases were broad enough to support cathedral-sized structures. Others featured internal chambers and passages, almost like the foundations for massive monumental buildings, rather than simple river crossings. Inspection engineers described them in confidential reports as disproportionate infrastructure, not merely oversized for safety, but sized for structures that don't exist, though nobody could specify what those structures might have been. Another peculiarity emerged in the consistency of construction methods. These weren't isolated anomalies on individual bridges. Inspection teams discovered similar impossible depths across dozens of bridges spanning thousands of kilometers. From the Elbe to the Seine, from the Potomac to the Mississippi, the pattern repeated. Foundations extending to depths far beyond their documented specifications. Ornamental work positioned where it should never have been seen. Construction quality suggesting open-air building rather than underwater assembly. It generated an unsettling possibility. These bridges may not have been built across rivers at all. They may have been built across dry valleys on flat ground, using construction techniques appropriate for terrestrial monuments rather than river crossings. The deeper the inspections proceeded, the stranger the geological evidence became. Core samples taken from around the foundations revealed sediment accumulation patterns that made no sense for gradually deposited river mud. Certain layers appeared to have been deposited rapidly, almost catastrophically. Others showed evidence of massive water flows that would have required river volumes far exceeding anything in documented history. But the finding that produced the most bewilderment was the vegetation remains found in sediment layers adjacent to the deep foundations. Fossilized root systems preserved organic matter, soil compositions indicating these foundations once stood in terrestrial environments, not aquatic ones. Yet they were located at depths that should have been underwater for millennia according to conventional geological models. The authorized explanation provided subsequently localized flooding events, gradual riverbed changes. But that does not account for why the organic evidence emerges at consistent depths across multiple rivers on multiple continents, not scattered randomly, but positioned systematically, as though a singular event buried all these bridges to similar depths simultaneously. Shortly following these discoveries, something peculiar started occurring. Inspection zones were closed, photographic documentation was classified. Deep portions of certain bridge foundations were isolated from continued investigation. Certain of this was formally designated as security concerns necessary to prevent infrastructure vulnerabilities from being publicised. But the choices about which bridges to restrict access to first and which inspection data to suppress generated subdued questions among witnesses, because the structures that were sealed from further examination were invariably the ones that contested the authorised timeline the most. The impossibly deep piers, the elaborately carved submerged sections, the oversized foundations, the geological evidence suggesting rapid burial. These bridges were possibly the most significant discovery of all. They weren't isolated anomalies. They were components of a systematic pattern, a network of crossings that appeared less like individual construction projects and more like a coordinated infrastructure system, aligned to similar specifications, built with comparable techniques, decorated with related aesthetic traditions, as though they once belonged to a substantially larger transportation network, one that connected territories long before any civilization we recognize supposedly possessed such capabilities. And yet, almost as quickly as the drought revealed them, rising water levels concealed them again. Their depths unverified, their implications unexplored, their presence quietly eliminated from public engineering discourse. When you examine the aftermath of the inspection program, something becomes impossible to disregard. The investigations didn't conclude. They were terminated, not completed, not resolved, terminated. The further the inspection crews proceeded, the more the character of their reporting transformed. Initial documentation was technical, almost routine. But by the conclusion, the language becomes restricted, vague, and oddly incomplete, as though someone else abruptly controlled what could be documented. And this is where the ultimate mystery commences. Because the deepest foundations they accessed beneath the major bridges weren't typical, they weren't practical, they weren't explained by any conventional construction methodology. They were something else altogether. Multiple confidential reports, the few that circulated among structural engineers, described foundations that abruptly transformed from the explainable to the impossible. Support structures so deep that modern drilling equipment struggled to reach their bases. Carved chambers integrated into pier foundations 40 meters down. Architectural spaces engineered for purposes far beyond simple bridge support, and construction that extended beyond the mapped foundation zones, continuing into unexplored depths below modern cities. But here's the aspect that always gets concealed. As water levels normalized, no comprehensive surveys were completed. The most anomalous foundations were the ones left undocumented. Engineers described water returning before full inspections could be conducted, access being restricted before measurements could be finalized, footage being archived before analysis could be completed. It wasn't gradual, it was prompt. The authorized explanation, budget constraints, competing priorities, structural assessment completion. But if it was solely about completing standard inspections, why were the most unusual, the deepest, the most historically significant foundations the ones left unexamined? And why were conventional shallow inspections continued on less remarkable structures? It doesn't make sense unless those deep foundations posed a different variety of threat, not a structural one, a historical one. Because if the bridges of Europe and North America genuinely displayed construction at depths impossible for their documented eras, and if certain of those foundations suggested construction in open air rather than underwater, then the complete accepted narrative of recent history starts to crumble. Imagine what it would signify if modern bridges spanning our rivers were merely the upper remnants of much larger structures built when the ground level was meters higher, before some catastrophic event buried their bases and filled the valleys with water. Imagine what it signifies if the bridges weren't constructed across rivers but across lands that subsequently became rivers through rapid geological transformation. And perhaps that is why the low water discoveries were quietly forgotten, not to safeguard the infrastructure, but to safeguard the narrative. The remaining inspection footage conveys its own narrative. Engineers position beside foundations that extend impossibly deep, ornamentation that suggests open-air construction, proportions that imply vanished superstructures. These aren't the varieties of findings historians prefer to address. They're the varieties they prefer not to acknowledge at all. And that brings us to the ultimate question. Why were the deepest foundations the most elaborate submerged architecture, the most geologically problematic structures left unexamined when water levels returned? Because when you step back, the configuration becomes apparent. The impossible depths were resubmerged, the ornate deep carvings were resubmerged, the oversized foundations were resubmerged, the catastrophic sediment evidence was resubmerged, and even portions of the inspection documentation vanished, almost as though the drought had inadvertently disclosed a chapter of history that wasn't meant to surface. A chapter suggesting ground levels meters higher than present. A chapter suggesting rapid geological transformation rather than gradual change. A chapter suggesting a recent catastrophic event that buried existing infrastructure and created our current rivers. A chapter more recent than we're taught to believe. And for one brief moment in our decade, the waters receded sufficiently to reveal it. But rather than investigating it thoroughly, we allowed the waters to rise again, resubmerged it, archived it, forgot it, or feigned to. Because if Europe's and North America's major bridges stand atop foundations built for a different world, then the genuine question is not what was revealed during the droughts. It's what else remains beneath the waters of the world. What other bridges, what other foundations, what other structures wait in depths that were once dry land? The bridge inspections weren't merely infrastructure assessment, they were a glimpse, a brief inadvertent glimpse into a version of history we were never intended to witness. Because if this is what one drought revealed, imagine what complete drainage would show. Something built before the waters came, something from before the flood. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.